In my high school, we had a teacher who dressed in old corduroy trousers, a sleeveless green jumper, and he wore yellow and green shirts underneath and always a multicolored dicky bow. This man was the meaning of the word eccentric. He loved all things history and all things gossip. He would hang around after the lesson and come over to our table of girls to ask us what we'd been up to. As we got a bit older, we started to realize he had got worse. He would now sit on the table next to us. He'd wink. He would make comments about our hair or makeup. Some days he would ask us if we liked his long, flowing hair. Then he would laugh. We used to find him funny, but now we were getting a scarier vibe from his actions. I told my mom, and she was disgusted. She knew exactly who this teacher was and warned me to stay away from him as much as I can. I was 15. She wasn't going to get away with not explaining why. She told me how my cousin had nearly ran away to his house when she was 13, where the plan was he would take her flower and save her from her council house life. Her mom found out when my cousin slipped out one day. She found her at this teacher's house. He begged her for forgiveness and she was disgusted. Yet, she was of ill health and didn't go forward with reporting him. She told my mom she genuinely believed he was sorry. He continued to work at that school, and now I had to deal with him. I reported him around 3 times for the comments he made, but that was all they were, and the head teacher did nothing. Until 6 years later, I was reading my local newspaper. Teacher jailed for having sex with pupil. Not only had he found a girl to groom, he had taken her virginity 1 year after I reported him back in high school. My mom even told me he had tried contacting my cousin for a good character reference in court. A couple of months ago, I was out celebrating my friend's birthday. I hadn't been feeling well, but I'd promised I would go and I had been looking forward to it for quite some time. I took some painkillers and went anyway. We went to a salsa bar and had a lot of fun dancing, talking, and laughing. Since I hadn't been feeling well, I decided to have 1 cocktail and then water. A couple of hours in, I started to feel ill again as the painkillers stopped working. I tried to power through because it was my friend's birthday, but eventually I had to tell my friend I had to go home. One of our other friends decided she wanted to go home as well, and we said our goodbyes and went on our way to the train, about a 20-minute walk. Very quickly, I started to feel worse. My head was spinning, and I had an excruciating pain in my throat. But I thought the train wasn't that far away anyway, and back then I lived 2 minutes from the station, and I was broke. We made our train and I felt even worse. I began to feel nauseous and had to throw up in the garbage can on the side of the compartment. Must have been funny to look at because quite a few young people who'd obviously been out drinking thought it'd be funny to take pictures of me with my head in the garbage can. My friends stopped them though. I had noticed a creepy fat guy with a comb over in our compartment, but hadn't thought much of it. I was feeling sick, and he wasn't that different from a lot of the other people, but I had a bad feeling anyway. About the same time, I began feeling dizzy, getting shaky and feeling hot and cold. I noticed the creepy guy was staring at me. And when I had thrown up again, he moved closer to me in the compartment. I instinctively moved away from him, but I couldn't move from the trash can in case I had to throw up again. My friend's stop came 2 stops before mine. She offered to stay and follow me home, but at that time of the night it was only possible to catch the train once every hour, and my apartment was very close to the train station. I said she could go and I would be okay. She made me promise to text her when I was home safe. I had to hold on to the doors of the train because I felt so lightheaded and sick. It took forever before the train pulled in my stop. The creepy guy had edged a bit closer to me, but by then I was feeling so sick I just wanted to go home and sleep and thought he perhaps had to get off at the same stop. It turned out that he did. Very quickly he was behind me and started caressing my back while saying he wanted to go home with me in very broken English. I couldn't talk that much because of the pain in my throat, and I was walking home slowly because of my dizziness. I tried to say no and push his hand away, but he proceeded to stroke my back and saying, "Only sleep, okay?" He smelled of tobacco and sweat, and up close his head was all sweaty and his hair was greasy. He was shorter than I am, and I'm not that tall. He had a big round stomach and was wearing a t-shirt, but no coat even though it was quite chilly. I saw he had sweat stains under his arm and on his upper lip. He kept repeating the phrase, "Only sleep, okay?" and started pushing me in the back as to make me walk quicker. I said no and go away, but didn't have the strength to shout or be very firm. "Only sleep, okay?" he said now, and started to sound aggressive even though every time he'd said it I'd answer with no and go away. He pushed me very firmly now in the back, and I began to be very worried he would follow me all the way home as I lived right by the station. I tried to muster up the strength to push him away, but he kept persisting. He had a tight grip on my arm with one hand, and the other hand was both caressing my behind and pushing me on the back. We were almost at my apartment. I lived on the 3rd floor, and there was a glass door on the 1st floor with a door phone. I decided I had to do something, or else he would follow me all the way to the apartment. I then suddenly stopped in my tracks. I felt his fingers tighten around my arm, and he looked at me both surprised and aggressive. In one motion, I pushed him away with one arm on his fat stomach, and the other pulled my arm out of his grip and yelled with all my strength, "Leave me the fuck alone!" He froze and gawed at me with his mouth open, and I ran as fast as I could to the glass door and turned to close it in a quick motion. He stood just outside the door frame and looked at me with this creepy expression of both aggression in his eyes and a crooked smile on his lips. I jumped and closed the door with him standing there and his face up against the glass. We stood there for about 3 seconds, even though it felt like much longer for me, before I turned on my heels and ran up the stairs into my apartment and locked the door. I don't think he expected me to be in the condition to do that, and I think he thought I was very, very drunk or something. But a long time after that, I checked the door before closing it to make sure he wasn't there to get into the stairwell and gain access to my apartment. I never saw him again, or his bad greasy comb-over and pit stains. I currently reside in Toronto, where I completed my undergrad in commerce, specifically in accounting. However, I was not able to secure a job in the city. The prospect of stable employment ultimately led me to a mediocre establishment in Barrie, Ontario. For the sake of anonymity, I will refer to this establishment as Company 123. As of now, I've spent about 6 months working at Company 123. I've spent roughly 2 hours a day making the round trip to work. Not optimal. On this particular evening, I ended up staying late. Depending on how the day goes, I usually head out at 6 p.m., but it was now 10 p.m. and my work wasn't nearly done. After contemplating the meaning of life and losing a good amount of hair, the spreadsheets added up. I took off at midnight, hoping to arrive home at 1 a.m. so I could at least get 5 hours of sleep before continuing the daily grind. The drive consists of a few side roads which lead you to the city and finally the highway ramp. I always take the same route, but it was dark now and everything seemed a little unfamiliar. I decided Google Maps would save the day. After entering the address, I selected the most efficient route provided. I had never taken this way home before, but Google said it's the best, and who am I to argue with a brilliantly coded application? I made the first turn and ended up on a dark side road. Instinctively, I switched on my high beams. The moment I did so, I spotted a white sedan pulled over about 2 kilometers down the road. As I steadily closed in, I noticed the driver door was wide open, protruding into my lane, with a person who appeared to be unconscious laying limp on the pavement next to the vehicle. I felt compelled to pull over, but I also valued my life and had read about roadside ambushes before. So instead, I just slowed down and decided to roll by in order to evaluate the situation prior to acting. I could see a middle-aged man, face down, eyes closed. It seemed as if the man genuinely needed help and no obvious red flags were in sight. My plan was to check if he's conscious and call for assistance. As I'm reaching for the door handle, I simultaneously glance in my rearview mirror to check for approaching cars since my car would be blocking a lane. That's when I spotted something. To give you an image of my location, I was on a 2-lane road surrounded by open farmland with those large rolls of hay scattered around. When I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw a head peeking over one of those rolls. No, sir, I'm out. After flooring my car, I looked back to see the unconscious man stand up and a figure appear from behind the roll of hay. Essentially, I guess I have this subreddit to thank for not being mugged. Thank you, and stay safe. This happened near the middle of December of 2012. I was 12 years old, going through what normal 12-year-olds shouldn't be. I was mentally screwed with a lot. Parents separated at a young age, forced me to leave my 2 half-brothers with my mother, whom I was so attached to, live with my dad, who later became depressed and fell into drugs, specifically heroin. My mother was a pill junkie. I was stuck between addicts, slowly learning what was occurring around me. It really hit me when my little sister came up to me with a dirty needle in her hand, asking innocently, "What's this?" And I screamed and yelled at her to throw it down and wash her hands and check every inch of her body for marks if it touched her. Countless tears while asking my father, "Please wake up. Why won't you wake up?" My life was a mess. I still think about this time in my life and have breakdowns. Since it was December, I was able to go over to my mother's place and spend some time with her and my beloved half-brother, little sister, and occasionally my brother's friend who I've also become close with over the times I've visited. He was basically a part of our family clique we formed. Time passes on. I'm enjoying myself with my brothers and sisters. We would spend our time in the basement. This basement was basically a bedroom. It had a TV, bed, couch, whatever you needed for it to be a bedroom, and it was pretty cool and our hangout spot. More time passes, it becomes dark. We've all migrated upstairs only because the pizza has arrived. We're all just talking, having fun. Then, there's a bang at the door. Another one of her junkie friends. Cool. Until she lets this guy in. At first glance, you can tell this dude's weird. Greasy hair, acne craters, sweaty, classic black trench coat, black boots, skinny, tall as hell. Naturally, I'm put off by it. I'm used to seeing some weird people come around due to my father and mother both being fiends and sellers. You get used to it, but you also have your guard up regardless, or at least I did. So they end up doing their thing, we mind our business, he leaves. My mom ends up having to leave somewhere. She takes our little sister with her. More time passes. My brothers end up going downstairs to hang out, while it's just me and their friend Dee. We're just talking, and I end up asking about this creepy guy. I end up finding out that he actually tries flirting with my little sister. Not sure exactly what he meant as in flirting, but I didn't try to pry into it. All he told me was he'd stare at her, and my mom even caught him trying to sneak off into her room at some point apparently. Want to know what's crazy? She was only 4 at that time. Sick fuck. Not too long after that conversation, there's a bang at the door. It sounded like the same bang earlier from the guy who was just there. This door is made, if you're tall enough, you can see through the glass part made into the door into the living room. And since he was so god-awful tall, he could easily, and since the couch being set up where we were sitting at, he could see right at us. Fuck. He sees us sitting there. He has this shit grin on his face. His eyes are locked onto me. He then says loudly, "Let me in. I'm your mom's friend. She said I can come back in." Now, dealing with these weird junkies, you don't want to anger them. So we're basically forced to let this weird dude in. Great. Not only was his presence weird enough without even talking to him, we basically have to sit there with him until my mom gets back. He sits down on the couch parallel from us, and I don't recall what we talked about, but I specifically remember him crushing a Xanax bar, then using $1 to snort it up, right in front of us. How polite, and him trying to get me to go to the store with him, until Dee spoke up and said, "I'll go instead," which led to this guy magically changing his mind. I didn't want to move from the spot on the couch, but I noticed my brand new iPod 4 was sitting on the windowsill near him, and I didn't want him somehow miraculously taking it and me being heartbroken, so I mustered up the courage to get up from my seat beside Dee, walk over to it, passing right in front of this creep. I finally reached the destination, his eyes following my every move. He asked me a question. "Are you Janet's daughter?" Yeah. "You look just like her." He whistles. Thanks. "How old are you?" 12. "Damn. If only you were 6 years older, you would be mine. So I wouldn't have to be going after your mom anymore." "But you're still so sexy, you'd be mine now anyways." While looking me up and down. Now guys, this dude had to be in his fucking 30s, hitting on a 12-year-old. That's when I fucking froze. He then gets up beside me and tries to look at my iPod, trying to take it from me, and that's when I remember all the things Dee told me about what he was doing to my sister. In a fit of rage, I yelled, "Get away from me, you fucking creep!" Apparently, it was loud enough that my brothers heard it and came running up the basement stairs. I made a dash away from this disgusting smelling man back to the couch where Dee was now standing at. My brothers now upstairs asking what happened, why did I yell, and I didn't even hesitate to say, "He just tried to fucking hit on me." Of course this shit-face denies it, but my brothers already knew about this guy constantly coming over, being weird to our little sister. Of course they're going to believe me over this greasy addict. My second oldest brother says in an obviously angrily calm voice to him, "What are you doing here without our mom being here?" Creepface explains what he told Dee and I, and it was clearly a bullshit lie. My mom may have been an addict, but she tried her best to keep us out of harm's way as best she could, as hypocritical as that sounds. Now, my brother is a ticking time bomb. If anyone tries anything with his family, he is not afraid to try and do anything about it. Instances where my mom was in an abusive relationship and he'd see her significant other hit her, he'd instantly jump in, beating the living hell out of the guy. He's not too big, but he's bulky, and around this time he was 15 or 16 years old and already 6 foot tall. This set him off the fucking edge when I told him what he said to me. He raged at him, throwing him onto the ground, on top of this man just beating him, to the point where Dee and my oldest brother had to drag him off of him. As they were pulling my other brother off this creep, he yells, "Stay the fuck away from my sister." I got a quick glance at the creep's now bloodied face. He still had a grin on his face. He made his way up and near the door and said, "I'll be back. Fuck you and your fucking mom. And if I see this little girl again, I'll have a nice surprise for her." and slammed the door. We ended up telling my mom when she came back, and she did nothing about it, probably because of the fact that he was a customer and practically harmless, I guess, at the time to her. Considering he got his ass beat by a 16-year-old, it wasn't too surprising either. I went home the next day in the morning and didn't see this guy until a year later, and he sure did have a grudge against me. I'd like to mention also, my sister was never sexually or any other way harmed by this guy. He just loved to be a fucking creep. This was about 9 or 10 years ago when The Nightmare Before Christmas in 3D came out in theaters. I was about 12 at the time and was one of those kids who was obsessed with the movie. I'd explained to my parents why it was necessary that I see the movie in 3D, so we decided to go to Dublin, a city my dad worked in that's about an hour away from where I lived, and go visit my dad's workplace, then go for lunch in the movie. Now, since I was an edgy preteen, I explained to my parents that I needed to sit by myself. They compromised and said they would sit in the row behind me so they can at least keep an eye on me. The theater made us go through what seemed like an hour of previews before the actual movie started, but that was okay because halfway into the previews I needed to go to the bathroom. I turned around to tell my mom and she offered to go with me. I got mad and said I can go by myself. She then pulled out my cell phone from her purse. This was around the time of flip phones and I never really cared to have a cell phone, so I always left it lying around and told me if something happens to call her. I rolled my eyes and said okay and left for the bathroom. While walking to the bathroom, I feel the presence of this guy walking behind me, but he was walking uncomfortably close. I could hear him breathing out of his mouth. I get to the bathroom and open the door and surprise, surprise, the bathroom was filled with other women and girls. I turn around and see the guy had sat on a bench and started staring at the floor. He was tall and lanky with long, greasy blonde hair. I turned back and went to the bathroom. There was a line in the bathroom, so I spent a good 5 minutes just waiting to go. Finally, my turn to go came. Afterwards, I washed my hands and my mom called me asking if I was okay. I explained to her the long line and that I'll be back soon and hung up. I got out of the bathroom and the guy was still on the bench. As I walked past him, he got up and started walking behind me again. I had my phone gripped in my hand, and I know what you're thinking, but no, I wasn't planning on calling my mom. I thought I was a badass and was planning on throwing my phone at him and then proceeding to kick his ass. My dad had spent most of my childhood teaching me how to fight and defend myself in case something like this happens. I got in the theater and sat back in my seat, and the guy sat in the same row a few seats down. The movie had finally started, and I couldn't even enjoy it because I felt the cold stare coming from this guy. The theater was somewhat empty, so this guy could have sat wherever he wanted, but he chose to sit by me. About 15 minutes into the movie, I noticed him shifting one seat closer. I looked back at my parents to see if they noticed, but instead they're enjoying the movie, so I start to think, if this guy moves one seat closer, I'll start a scene. I must have zoned out on the movie because the movie is about halfway in, and the guy is now 2 seats away from me. He's leaning in, and his arm is resting on the seat next to him, as if he's ready to grab me. Without taking my eyes off the screen, I thought, this is it. I'm gonna knock this guy out. When I hear my dad yell, "Get the fuck away from my daughter before I break your neck," my mom threatens to call the cops. I look and see that the guy starts to run out, but really wanting to go out with the promise I made to myself, I throw my phone at him. I missed and hit the wall. The movie stops and the lights turn on. The manager rushes in and asks what's going on. My dad tells him he saw some guy try to reach over and grab me. The manager calls the cops and I give them my statement. The entire ride home was a lecture from my parents about being careful when you're alone in public, and I just sat in the back seat of the car, beating myself up about my poor aim. I don't believe in the law of attraction as a general rule. I tried manifesting things such as money, job opportunities, and a relationship with a guy who looks like he is fresh off the pages of any fashion magazine, and gotten bupkis. So there's the proof that it doesn't work, or at least not for anything positive. I blame it on my love for horror films and stalker stories. It's the only explanation of the shit that happened. About a week before Thanksgiving 2013, a friend of mine asked me to house sit for her and her husband and keep her cat company since they decided to visit family in Oklahoma at the last minute. I really didn't want to. You know that feeling you get in your gut when something isn't quite right, but you don't know why? I don't know if it's fight or flight, survival instincts, or spontaneous clairvoyance, but I've ended up paying a price when I decided to dismiss that sudden twinge in my stomach and random shakiness as nerves and silliness. I'm overly analytical and have to find reason in everything. I have common sense, but I just ignore it. It's a flaw, I know. My friend was practically begging me to help her out, so I reluctantly said yes. The house was cool, and I had a chance to get away from my roommates for a few days. Despite the screamingly bad feeling I had, I was looking forward to it. Things were okay at first. Her cat and my cat were getting along. I was getting along with their bar stash, and the bed in the guest room was a welcome change from the boulder I was sleeping on. Most importantly, I had peace, quiet, and full use of her car. Life was good. I had to work that Monday and Tuesday, but since things were quite slow, I stayed up super late watching scary movies and half-assing it when I went to the office. Tuesday night, the cats and I celebrated my having the rest of the week off by making alcoholic milkshakes for just me and watching Saw in the dark for the millionth time when I heard a man's voice near the front door. I figured it was just people walking by. The house is close to the sidewalk and didn't think anything of it. But when I heard it again near the living room window behind me, I got a little spooked and turned the volume down. After a minute or so, I pulled the curtains back and saw a shirtless man walking across my friend's yard. He was walking towards the house across the street, and since it was too dark to make out any features, I let it go. We'd had a bit of a cold snap, and I think it was in the 40s that night. That's a little too nippy for walking around half naked, and the whole thing seemed completely wrong, so my twinge was alerting extra hard. Plus, I was creeped out by what had just occurred, and the movie, so I called it a night and went to bed. I reasoned that since this city is crazy, I passed by and exchanged pleasantries with people who were as naked as the day God made them in broad daylight. This was nothing to fret about. I double-checked the locks and the doors and the windows to be sure, though. Wednesday was pretty normal for the most part. I hit the gym, went to Starbucks, and FaceTime with my friend, listening to her complain about her relatives and how much her hometown sucks, and later ran errands, YOLO'd a little more on the bar stash, and indulged in a good Netflix binge. It was a good day, and in hindsight, I think I was just being set up for what was going to happen later in the day. Kind of like the calm before the storm, the other shoe dropping, paying for having such a nice day, etc. Wednesday night, I was in my usual spot in the living room, watching some cheesy horror movie on Netflix, when I kept hearing tapping and scraping sounds on all of the windows. I just ignored it at first, since it was intermittent, and it was kind of windy outside, but soon ditched that idea as I realized that it was rhythmic and deliberate. The person doing it was deliberately going from window to window on the first floor, and with the living room and kitchen being set up in a sort of horseshoe design, I felt like I was being hunted. It sounded like metal on glass, so I figured whomever was doing this had a knife that they were using to knock on the windows and making it slide across the glass. Tap, tap, scrape. Tap, tap, scrape. and so on and so forth. There may have been a chuckle or two as the guy slowly walked back and forth between the windows. I don't think I've ever heard anything as menacing as this asshole's laugh. He was clearly enjoying what he was doing. Whenever I read stories about stalking or general creepiness, I've always pictured myself in the OP's shoes as I read the story, thinking about what I would do or how I would respond if it were me. I've mostly been a huge chicken in these visualizations, but this time it really was me, and I was mostly a huge chicken. I'm nothing if not consistent, I guess. Oddly enough, I wasn't outwardly scared. I forced myself to at least appear to be calm. I figured that the guy could see me because he focused on the set of windows directly behind me and scraped extra slowly right behind my head. I was not going to let him know I was afraid, even though I was on the verge of spontaneously watering the couch. I continued to sit on the couch cross-legged, frozen. I felt my heartbeat speed up. I noticed the sudden dryness in my mouth, and I realized with a sinking feeling that my phone was upstairs. There was no calling for help. In my panic, I expected him to burst in any second if he saw me moving. Despite this, even though I was shaking violently on the inside, I refused to let this guy know that I was afraid. To borrow a phrase from a college friend, I figured that if I was going to get out, I wasn't going to be a pussy about my situation. If I could get a piece of this dude's ass as he hurt me, then I was going to do it. Coherent thought fled, but a simple phrase of "fuck him" repeated itself in my mind. My brain was practically scream-chanting this at me as I tried to figure out what I was going to do. The guy knew that I knew what was up because he pressed himself against the window directly behind me and began hurling profanities and talked about what he planned in massive detail. He said it was my time and thanked me for wearing tights and no pants. It took me a minute to realize he actually meant leggings. He said that I had asked for this by going outside while wearing tights. He asked if I was wearing tights right then. I was, because I live in them. He said that I was going to have his baby after he got inside. Part of me wishes that I hadn't turned the volume down on the movie because I could hear every disgusting thing he said, and most of it was too vile to repeat here. Time just seemed to stand still, and I don't think I've ever experienced as much silence as I did that night. Even the cats were frozen in fear, looking at me wide-eyed but not making a sound. No offense to them, but I suddenly found myself wishing I had adopted a pit bull at that exact moment because they were absolutely useless. I've heard about cats who have defended their owners from intruders, but my cat and her cat were happy to just stay crouched down on the floor and wait for me to handle the situation. Then, he talked about how he'd done this before. He followed a woman and tried to grab her, but she fought him off and got away. He laughed about this too, and said he'd wanted to get her pregnant. It was at this point that I slid off the couch and onto the floor, mostly because I didn't want him to see me, but also because my legs were asleep from holding that awful position so long. I crawled to the kitchen, pulled myself up, and got the biggest knife I could find. I also grabbed her toaster. Don't ask me why I chose that as a weapon, because I don't know. Something inside me had snapped. I don't know if it was his verbal abuse, the shenanigans with the window, the fact he'd talked about watching me and described what I'd been wearing, or his entitled attitude that told him he could do whatever sexual shit he wanted to me because I was alone. But I was beyond pissed. I'm pretty sure that every law enforcement professional will say that what I did next was nuts, but I was a little nuts with anger and fear, so it follows. I walked back to the window, and the guy was still talking shit and laughing about it. I hadn't realized I'd walked away. I put the knife and toaster on the couch, took a deep breath and another, and then ripped those fucking curtains open as angrily as possible. It caught the douche off guard, because he peeled himself from the window and backed up so hard that he stumbled and dropped his weapon, a wrench. He was completely naked. He started grinning with satisfaction as soon as he saw me, began rubbing himself and saying, "Let me in, bitch." It was my turn to press myself against the window, which I did with a deranged Jack Nicholson in the Shining type of smile. He kept rubbing himself and telling me to make it easy and let him in, but I just kept smiling and slowly held up the knife. I calmly and slowly mouthed the words, "I'm going to kill you," while staring directly into his eyes and maintaining the crazy smile. I kept thinking I was insane for taunting him, that he was going to find a way to get inside and do God knows what to me, but it was all I had. A quick side note, I developed this smile in college, when dudes would get aggressive in clubs and bars or would try to talk to me on the street when I really didn't feel like talking. I expanded its use to people who just won't take no for an answer. I stand stock still, open my eyes as widely as possible, and give them the craziest smile without saying a word. It usually works. And miraculously, my crazy tactic worked. Okay, it may not have worked. I'm not sure if it did the trick on its own so as much as that someone with extremely bright lights drove by the house at that exact moment. They apparently drove a little too slowly for the guy's liking because he got spooked by it and disappeared. I just stood there, not breathing for what felt like an hour until I came back to myself. I couldn't actually process what had just occurred. To be honest, I am still in disbelief that it happened. I didn't call the police for a couple of reasons. I had a bad experience with campus police during my college years. A guy shoved me to the ground and stole my purse as I walked back to my dorm room one night. The responding officers seemed rather impatient and incredulous as I shakily tried to tell him what happened. He either didn't believe me or just didn't want to be bothered, and the memory of his attitude toward me has always stayed with me. Also, my friend's husband had a bit of weed in the house, and when I told him what had happened, he became rather paranoid about the police searching the house and finding it if I called them, so I didn't call. I'll always regret not calling. My friend and her husband no longer live in that house, and the guy was never seen again. We think that he was some drifter who happened to see an opportunity to harass a woman or worse and tried to seize it. To say that I had a lot to be thankful for the next day is an understatement. I'm thankful for the friends who talked to me calmly and waited for me to stop freaking out so I could tell them what had happened. I was talking about 1,000,000 miles per second, and it took a few minutes for me to get everything out. I would have hung up if it were me. I'm thankful for my ex-boss at the bar where I used to work. He sent 2 bouncers or door guys to help me, and they helped me pack up, drove me home, and stayed with me the rest of the night. Most importantly, I'm thankful I'm still here and that I learned to listen to the twinge more often. That's probably the biggest lesson to come from this. Don't ignore that feeling. I haven't given it much thought, so I have no idea if any of this makes sense. I'm still in a bit of shock because the whole thing plays like a movie in my mind, and the only reason I'm sharing it is because the memory is messing with me this week and I just have to get it out. I created a second Reddit account just to tell this story because I don't want to ever look at my regular account's post and seeing it staring back at me. It's never bothered me this much before, but for some reason, this Thanksgiving season just dredged it all up. I wish my mind to go back to blocking the memory like it's done for the past 2 years, but that's not happening. I'm already seeing a therapist for my depression, so I think I'll eventually tell her the story too. I ate all of the things this week, beyond what's expected for a holiday week, and I usually don't do that, so I'll obviously have to talk to her about it soon. But anyway, creepy dude who stalked me for 2 days and thought he was going to hurt me. Fuck you. So I'm a male nurse at a large hospital in San Francisco. I work in the ER, and as is custom for Thanksgiving night, it was very busy. Now my wife is also a nurse for the same hospital. She works in labor and delivery. Between babies being born left and right and the people coming into the ER, we hadn't had a chance to take a break together as we try to do every shift. So when she called, I figured it was to say she wanted to meet up for a bite to eat in the cafeteria. When I answered, I heard in the background a male voice screaming profanities in the background and my wife, who was fluent in Spanish, trying to calm this guy down. She told me their pager wasn't working and they needed security stat. I quickly hung up, called for security, told my fellow nurses what was going on, and ran for labor and delivery, worried sick about my wife. When I ran almost square smack dab into this visibly angry man. He wasn't huge, but bro definitely worked out and not at the gym. He was covered in prison tattoos and he was obviously a banger. I worked out regularly, but I knew this guy could kick my ass. He looked at me, gave me this sick grin and started heading towards me, spouting off in Spanish. I don't speak fluent Spanish, but what I could understand scared the living shit out of me. I'm backing up as fast as I can. I start buzzing the door to the ER frantically for them to let me in. This guy's literally a foot away from me, and the door opens and I'm pulled into safety by a doctor. Gangbanger punches the door a few times, making a dragging sign across his throat while grinning at us both. Next thing I know, the police rush into the corridor he's in, and it takes 2 security officers and 2 cops to subdue this dude. I finally make it to my wife, who thankfully was shaken up but unhurt. She explained to me what happened. A young girl, only 14, came in, high fever, vomiting, distended belly. The banger claimed he was her brother, and they needed to cut her open to get her baby. They did an ultrasound, and to their horror they realized she wasn't pregnant, and she had bags of drugs in her stomach. It's very common for drug mules to bring over young women from Mexico carrying drugs that way. Homeboy freaked out when they informed him his sister needed emergency surgery, and no, he wasn't getting his drugs. Thankfully, the girl survived, but the sad thing is, she will most likely be deported once she recovers. This story is about my dad's ex-girlfriend. My dad has horrible luck with women. He's like a crazy magnet. Every woman he has ever dated, except his current girlfriend, has been abusive both mentally and physically. This list includes my mother. But this story is about his last girlfriend, Mary. She has gone from stalking not only him, but me, my husband, and our daughter too. They met at a Christmas party and hit it off. He had just gotten out of another bad relationship with a different woman that he had been on and off with for 3 years. She was the classic narcissist type. Well, Mary seemed different. She claimed she was also just out of an abusive relationship. They went out for a few months, but she never let Dad over to her place. He didn't find it at all weird until he received a call from a man who said Mary was his wife and wanted to know how my dad knew her. At first, my dad thought the guy was her ex still trying to control her, but things started to add up. He finally confronted Mary, and she gave him some sob story about how her ex was refusing to sign the papers, but they were separated. Dad did a bit of digging and even talked to Mary's parents at one point. He found out that not only was Mary definitely still married, but she wasn't even separated from her husband. As far as everyone in her life knew, she was happily married, and my dad was just a friend, if they knew about him at all. Needless to say, he broke up with her. She lost it, started showing up at his work, calling in the middle of the night, texting him 50+ times a day, all that good stuff. My dad miffed states twice and changed his number several times to try and get away from her, but she always found him. Love letters would arrive in the mail, or she would call and say she was coming to see him. Then she found my phone number. Probably sometime after my dad moved in with me, she started texting me almost as much as him. Once I married my husband and had my daughter, she really went all out, sending me presents for her new granddaughter, always wanting updates and the like. I never replied, and always sent back unopened packages or donated the items she had sent directly to me from shops. Everything finally came to a head when she arrived at my dad's doorstep while he was at work with a casserole for him. She gave it to his roommate and told him it was because she noticed my dad was losing weight. He told his roommate to toss it. He didn't want to risk poison since he had just applied for a restraining order. That night, she showed up at my apartment while my husband worked the overnight shift. It was after 1 a.m. when she started knocking on my door. I was glad that I had sent my toddler to my aunt and uncle's for the night when I saw it was her. She left banana bread on my doorstep that we threw out as soon as my husband got home. The next night, I again left my toddler with my aunt and uncle in case she came back. She did. I started getting texts from her as she pounded on my door. She wanted to see her grandbaby and have some girl time with me. They slowly devolved into demands for me to open the door. I called the cops. While I was on the phone with dispatch, my neighbor came out ready to take her on. He told her cops were on the way since his wife was already calling them. She disappeared pretty quick into the park across the street. Cops didn't catch her, but my dad's restraining order did get granted. We have since moved across the state, but she still texts me from time to time wanting to know how my dad is or what my daughter is up to. I never answer, but I do save all of her texts, just in case I have to get my own restraining order as well. I'm a 16-year-old girl, and this happened to me last year only a few weeks after I turned 15. For some background, my sister is 3 years older than me, and so this took place when she had only just turned 18. She had been dating her boyfriend on and off again for about 2 years. We'll call him Steven. Just so you know, my parents are divorced, so I live with my mom, my sister, and my older brother. We had our house renovated instead of moving out when the house got cramped. You see, the layout is that is a very small bedroom my brother has, a medium bedroom my mom has, and a large bedroom me and my sister shared. Well, as we got older, we obviously wanted our own space, so my mom had a wall built between the large room to make 2 smaller rooms. The only problem was that you'd have to walk through one room to get to the other. At first, I had the room that would have to be walked throughout by my sister so she was able to get to her room. So my sister is dating this guy who's the same age as our dad. Steven also had a daughter the same age as my sister. This guy was a terrible influence on my sister. She stopped going to school, went to raves, and was introduced to drugs, and all at the hands of her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was very well known in our small village, as only a few years back he had a huge drug raid at his old home. He also used to get into a lot of fights, big fights. He once almost killed a guy in just a fist fight. He was also well known to furiously beat his girlfriends. So no surprise, neither of my parents approved of him. This caused my sister to move and live with him in, as ridiculous as this sounds, his tent out in a wooded area. You see, he was living there because he became homeless. So against my mom's better judgment, she invited him to live at our house so she'd be able to know my sister was safe. I'm a very reserved and shy person, especially around people I don't know. He was no different. Obviously, he had to walk through my room to get to my sister's, and I had always assumed my unease and uncomfortableness was due to not knowing him. Fast track a few weeks. By the time my sister turned 17, she found out she was pregnant. She's thrilled, but Steven is not. My mom was disappointed my sister had gotten pregnant so young, but was happy to support her. One day my mom finds out my sister's distraught as she tells my mom that Steven wants her to abort the baby and had forced her to take a pill which would start the process. As bad as it sounds, I didn't really zone into whatever was going on. At the time, I didn't realize I was slowly sinking into depression. Fast forward a few months and my sister and the boyfriend decided to keep the baby, and she had a growing belly while my depression worsened. At one point, I decided to try and tell my mom how I felt. She ended up sobbing and blaming herself, which only made me feel absolutely awful. Safe to say, I didn't try to tell her again. As the months go by, things start to get a little weird. I'd walk up in the middle of the night and find Steven just sort of standing in my room. As soon as he would caught, he would either rush into my sister's room or out of mine to go downstairs. As uncomfortable as it made me, I didn't bother to bring it up to my mom. We weren't on the best of terms as I stopped going to school regularly until I was just not going anymore at all. Other strange things were the inappropriate comments on what I'd wear. I'm a well-figured girl, even from a young age, so the comments were normal from boys at my school, but it was weird coming from my sister's boyfriend, not to mention how much older he was. There was one particular item of clothing he had a liking for, a silk nightgown that was a little above the knee and had a small plunge in the neckline. As you know, I'm a reserved person, so showing my body makes me feel very uncomfortable. But I liked this nightdress because of its softness, so I did wear it a lot, but that was before I noticed his attitude towards it. To start, he would simply say, "I like that nightdress." I chose just to ignore him, but then he started to say, "I like the way you look in that," or "I like when you wear that." I was creeped out and just stopped wearing it, wearing anything revealing around him in fact. I went unbothered by him for a while. Then my sister had the baby, and me and her swapped rooms as mine was slightly bigger than hers. Me and my mom were constantly arguing, while more of her belittling me and making me feel worse than I already did. So when my nephew was born on my birthday, I spent my birthday alone the whole day simply crying in my room. I hated living there and wanted to be anywhere else. A few weeks pass, and my mom in her own anger reach a boiling point, and we explode in an extremely awful shouting match. I still don't know why, but Steven decided to get involved and also began to disrespect me. At some point, my sister pulled my mom downstairs to try and calm her down and left me alone upstairs with Steven. He left my room and I assumed he went downstairs. I was wrong. He actually decided to shut my sister's door, came back into my room, and then shut my door. This is where shit hits the fan. Steven completely blows up in my face. This terrifying 6-foot-something muscular man towered over my 5'4" small frame as he shouted things that genuinely left me terrified. It gave me the shakes just recalling it. He screamed in my face how, if I was his daughter and I was acting like this, then he'd lock me in my room with nothing but a mattress and would only receive one meal a day. He continued to go on and on about how disgusting and disrespectful I was. I was on the verge of a panic attack, as I swear I blacked out for a few seconds out of fear, which caused me to fall into my bed. He was so angry that he was physically holding himself back not to throw a punch at me. I could see it in his face. He wanted to hit me badly. He would pull his arm back as if to throw a punch, but then stop when his fist came close to my face. I thought he was going to beat me black and blue, as he was threatening and yelling in my face that he would. But the most disturbing part of this situation, the one thing he said, and I won't be able to forget, was when he hissed quietly in my face that I deserved to be beaten and raped. After that, he walked out, and I sobbed against my bedroom door, terrified he would come back and keep to that promise. The next morning was a school day, and Steven decided I needed a wake-up call at 6 a.m. and came into my room, picked me up while I was still asleep, and then dropped me. I woke up terrified and in pain. He then crouched down to be face-to-face with me and said if I didn't go to school that he'd do a lot worse than that to me. He then went back to my sister in her room, told her what he did, and then both of them laughed about it while I was crying in the next room. I went to school that day, not even bothering to retrieve my lunch from my mom. Once I was at school, I go straight to my favorite teacher and proceeded to have a complete mental breakdown. I explained what had happened and how I was too afraid to go home. Social services was called along with my mom. My mom told me that the minute she found out what happened, she demanded that Stephen take his stuff and leave. After the incident, I was not allowed to go out on my own because Stephen had been threatening to kill me and set our house on fire. He had even attacked my older brother, who had to get stitches after his eyebrows split open. Our house had to have a red alert on it, so if we called the police, they would come straight away. After about a month or so, it was quiet, and we didn't hear from Stephen, and I was glad. Then I was informed that Stephen had been arrested. The reason? He had raped an old ex of his, one that lived in the same village as me, and he was being jailed for a minimum of 8 years. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit his family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform in a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter and getting colder and darker, and just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such a train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be long until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night and offered him a meal in a room at her house, which she said was an hour's walk from the station. Lodgings with the locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and Great-Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was very tired and hungry. They went inside and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John had been able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her. They said goodnight and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called to her, but she didn't answer and he heard nothing else. Figuring that he would deal with it in the morning and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to pee and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees and began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that that's where the pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. "Nope," Great-Uncle John said, and went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else was there, would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with the blanket. He then got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs and then toward the room. The lock clicked and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move toward the bed, Then he heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person went out of the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs, and then there was silence again. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury and began to run into a field behind the house towards lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks on it, and John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what had happened to the authorities, since at that time in the USSR there was a distinct chance he would have been the one who got into trouble. He just thanked God he escaped, and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take another way. Since I hadn't been feeling well, I decided to have one cocktail and then water. A couple of hours in, I started to feel ill again as the painkillers stopped working. I tried to power through because it was my friend's birthday, but eventually I had to tell my friend I had to go home. One of our other friends decided she wanted to go home as well, and we said our goodbyes and went on our way to the train, about a 20-minute walk. Very quickly, I started to feel worse. My head was spinning, and I had an excruciating pain in my throat. But I thought the train wasn't that far away anyway, and back then I lived 2 minutes from the station, and I was broke. We made our train, and I felt even worse. I began to feel nauseous and had to throw up in the garbage can on the side of the compartment. Must have been funny to look at because quite a few young people who'd obviously been out drinking thought it'd be funny to take pictures of me with my head in the garbage can. My friends stopped them though. I had noticed a creepy fat guy with a comb over in our compartment, but hadn't thought much of it. I was feeling sick, and he wasn't that different from a lot of the other people, but I had a bad feeling anyway. About the same, I tried to say no and push his hand away, but he proceeded to stroke my back and saying, "Only sleep, okay?" He smelled of tobacco and sweat, and up close his head was all sweaty and his hair was greasy. He was shorter than I am, and I'm not that tall. He had a big round stomach and was wearing a t-shirt, but no coat even though it was quite chilly. I saw he had sweat stains under his arm and on his upper lip. He kept repeating the phrase, "Only sleep, okay?" and started pushing me in the back as to make me walk quicker. I said no and go away, but didn't have the strength to shout or be very firm. "Only sleep, okay?" he said now, and started to sound aggressive even though every time he'd said it I'd answer with no and go away. He pushed me very firmly now in the back, and I began to be very worried he would follow me all the way home as I lived right by the station. I tried to muster up the strength to push him away, but he kept persisting. He had a tight grip on my arm with one hand, and the other hand was both caressing my behind and pushing me on the back. We were almost at my apartment. I lived on the 3rd floor. In my high school, we had a teacher who dressed in old corduroy trousers, a sleeveless green jumper, and he wore yellow and green shirts underneath and always a multicolored dicky bow. This man was the meaning of the word eccentric. He loved all things history and all things gossip. He would hang around after the lesson and come over to our table of girls to ask us what we'd been up to. As we got a bit older, we started to realize he had got worse. He would now sit on the table next to us. He'd wink. He would make comments about our hair or makeup. Some days he would ask us if we liked his long, flowing hair, then he would laugh. We used to find him funny, but now we were getting a scarier vibe from his actions. I told my mom, and she was disgusted. She knew exactly who this teacher was and warned me to stay away from him as much as I can. I was 15. She wasn't going to get away with not explaining why. She told me how my cousin had nearly ran away to his house when she was 13, where the plan was he would take her flower and save her from her council house life. Her mom found out when my cousin slipped out one day. She found her at this teacher's house. He begged her for forgiveness and she was disgusted. Yet, she was of ill health and didn't go forward with reporting him. She told my mom she genuinely believed he was sorry. He continued to work at that school, and now I had to deal with him. I reported him around 3 times for the comments he made, but that was all they were, and the head teacher did nothing. Until 6 years later, I was reading my local newspaper. Teacher jailed for having sex with pupil. Not only had he found a girl to groom, he had taken her virginity 1 year after I reported him back in high school. My mom even told me he had tried contacting my cousin for a good character reference in court. A couple of months ago, I was out celebrating my friend's birthday. I hadn't been feeling well, but I'd promised I would go and I had been looking forward to it for quite some time. I took some painkillers and went anyway. We went to a salsa bar and had a lot of fun dancing, talking, and laughing. One time I began feeling dizzy, getting shaky and feeling hot and cold. I noticed the creepy guy was staring at me. And when I had thrown up again, he moved closer to me in the compartment. I instinctively moved away from him, but I couldn't move from the trash can in case I had to throw up again. My friend's stop came 2 stops before mine. She offered to stay and follow me home, but at that time of the night it was only possible to catch the train once every hour, and my apartment was very close to the train station. I said she could go and I would be okay. She made me promise to text her when I was home safe. I had to hold onto the doors of the train because I felt so lightheaded and sick. It took forever before the train pulled in my stop. The creepy guy had edged a bit closer to me, but by then I was feeling so sick I just wanted to go home and sleep and thought he perhaps had to get off at the same stop. It turned out that he did. Very quickly he was behind me and started caressing my back while saying he wanted to go home with me in very broken English. I couldn't talk that much because of the pain in my throat, and I was walking home slowly because of my dizziness.